Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're wrestling with a question that I think feels intensely personal and just utterly urgent to anyone paying attention. And it's this. Why does democratic discourse feel so fundamentally broken? Why is the public square in this age of, infinite connection just so corrupted by manipulation and digital chaos?
That's a really astute observation, and unfortunately a very accurate one.
Right.
And it brings us straight to one of the most significant sociological and political thinkers on this, really of the last century, Jürgen Habermas.
Okay.
Our deep dive today is based on a really extensive analysis of his 1962 classic, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere.
Which people just call STPS, right?
Exactly, STPS.
Yeah.
And crucially, we're going to be contrasting that original sort of ideal critique with his surprisingly dark reflections from just a few years ago in 2021.
And what's he looking at in 2021?
He's addressing the new, what he sees as an existential threat posed by globalization, by digitalization, and commodification.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how quickly Habermas's original critique was. Well, it was validated.
Tragically validated.
Tragically, yes, by real-world events. We learned from our sources that the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962...
The very same year his book came out.
The very same year. It just immediately vindicated his whole analysis of how mass media and, political advertising were already manipulating the process of democratic will formation.
The irony is just.
Yeah.
It's striking. Habermas is in the middle of arguing that the public sphere is already dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And in the background, the fate of the entire planet is being decided in absolute secrecy, completely outside the bounds of public deliberation.
So the sources actually say the crisis was avoided by what? Sheer luck?
Sheer luck, yes.
Yeah.
It completely circumvented every single democratic safeguard, every mechanism designed to hold power accountable.
Think about that for a moment. So Habermas is arguing that democracy, back in the mid-20th century, was already failing. It was being managed, manipulated by big media, turning citizens into, consumers of political stories?
Exactly.
And at the exact same time, the two great superpowers are making decisions that could literally end civilization with zero oversight from the very publics they supposedly serve.
It's the ultimate proof of his point. That crisis, handled in total shadow, confirmed that the critical public sphere he idealized was already just severely dysfunctional under the pressures of Cold War governance.
It's like a stark historical baseline for the decline he was mapping out.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And our promise to you, our listener, is that we'll do this with the detailed and in-depth understanding you expect, but we'll also make it really accessible.
That's the goal.
Our mission today is sort of threefold. First, we need to grasp Habermas's original ideal vision of the public sphere. What should have happened.
The blueprint.
The blueprint, exactly. Second, we have to understand the hidden economic and philosophical fictions that were undermining that ideal from the very beginning.
Right, the cracks in the foundation.
And then finally, we're going to apply all of these insights directly to the crisis we're all living through, the crisis of social media and neoliberalism.
Okay, so to properly set the stage for all of that, we absolutely have to internalize Habermas's core defining distinction. It's really the central pillar of his entire democratic theory.
And what is that?
He draws an absolute, almost sacred line between the market and the public sphere.
Okay, so the market, in this context, that's the realm of private property owners. You go there to pursue your own individual interests, right? As a consumer.
Yes, you're exchanging goods, services.
Yeah.
The goal is private profit, private satisfaction.
But the public sphere is totally different.
Radically different. That's the space where people assemble as citizens. Think of a coffee house or a parliament.
And their purpose there is not to buy or sell.
No. Their purpose is to exchange rational, critical arguments. And this is key.
Yeah.
The arguments are judged only by their intrinsic merit, by their logical force, not by the status or wealth of the person speaking.
And the ultimate goal is
to reach conclusions about the general interest. What's good for society as a whole?
And this is the critical transition point for understanding our current crisis, isn't it? Our sources warn that when these two realms get conflated, when the public sphere is basically housed inside the market, which is what social media is, then that rational deliberation, that inclusion, it just can't be safeguarded.
That is the powerful modern analogy. Social media, in Habermas's updated reading, it isn't the digital version of an 18th century public square or an Athenian agora.
So what is it?
It's a privately owned shopping mall.
That is such a powerful image. So the key takeaway for you listening isn't just that the content online is often angry or false. It's that the infrastructure itself is hostile to the very idea of citizenship because it's organized around profit.
Exactly. The rules of the mall, the
Mm.
terms of service, the algorithms, the content moderation, they're all determined by the management.
And the management always reserves the right
To throw you out, based on criteria that at the end of the day serve shareholder interests, not the general interest.
That distinction alone. I mean, it takes us from just complaining about misinformation to really analyzing the deep structural flaw of how our modern digital world is governed.
Okay, so let's rewind. Let's go back 3 centuries to the moment Habermas says this ideal first emerged. We're exploring the beautiful, though maybe tragically short-lived blueprint of what he calls the bourgeois public sphere, or BPS.
And the core idea, the normative thesis for establishing it, was extraordinarily ambitious. It was institutionalized to achieve nothing less than the dissolution of domination through rational public discourse.
The dissolution of domination.
Yeah.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that authority should no longer rest on, say, arbitrary power or tradition or religious sanctity.
Okay.
It should only rest on the power of the better argument, which you arrive at through dialogue. The guiding principle here is pure enlightenment. Veritas non auctoritas facit logum.
Truth, not authority, makes law. Precisely. So the BPS was this attempt to rationally reconstruct the norms that came out of the constitutional revolutions of the late 18th century. And it draws very, very deeply on Immanuel Kant's philosophy.
So how exactly does Kant fit in here? How does he provide the intellectual scaffolding for this political revolution?
Well, Habermas locates the whole method of the BPS in Kant's 1784 essay, answering the question, what is enlightenment?
A classic.
A classic. And Kant championed what he called the public use of reason. This was, at the time, a really radical demand that institutions hitherto considered untouchable.
Like the church and state.
Exactly. Religion and law-giving. They must be subjected to free and open examination by the citizenry.
So institutions couldn't just say, because I said so, or this is sanctioned by God.
No, they couldn't. They couldn't rely on sanctity or majesty or just unquestioned tradition. Their legitimacy had to be able to withstand rigorous public critique.
And Kant's bet was what? That if people were given the freedom to do this,
He argued that if granted this fundamental freedom to engage in public discourse, the public should and would enlighten itself. That was the huge shift. From being a passive subject receiving laws from on high to an active citizen demanding that laws be justified from below.
that sounds like an intellectual revolution that had to come before the political one. But where do people actually learn how to do this? How to engage in this kind of rational, self-critical debate?
And for that, Habermas points to the literary public sphere as the crucial prelude. It was a kind of training ground.
A training ground.
Yes. The literary sphere prepared the individual psychologically, socially. Habermas privileges the 18th century moral weeklies journals, like The Spectator in England. He calls them the key phenomenon.
And what were these journals like?
They were a blend of polite literature, moral essays, social commentary. And they allowed the rising bourgeois individuals to cultivate their sense of self, but in the private sphere first.
What sort of cultivation are we talking about here? It's not political strategy.
No, not at all. It was about teaching the cultivation of the person. If you were reading The Spectator, you weren't reading about political parties or taxes. You were reading about manners, taste, friendship, morality.
So personal development.
Yes. And this intimate personal cultivation created a basis for what Habermas called a morally pretentious rationality that the bourgeois would later bring into political life.
Morally pretentious rationality. That's a striking phrase.
It is. The argument wasn't just, I want this law because it benefits me. It was, this law is right because it aligns with universal moral principles that I, as a cultivated person, can rationally deduce.
So it's a high-minded, almost idealistic approach to argument. But you said this idealism starts not in the coffee house, but in the home.
That's the really unique causality that Habermas identifies. The DPS ideal literally starts in the most private space imaginable, the conjugal family's intimate sphere.
So the nuclear family.
In a sense, yes. This was a new kind of intimacy, a domestic world separate from the demands of the state and the market. And here, individuals developed what the sources call saturated and free interiority.
Saturated and free interiority.
It was a space defined by love, freedom, emotional cultivation. A space where the individual was seen as a moral entity, not just an economic or political one.
So the ability to debate complex political ideas rationally in public actually comes from the emotional maturity and moral development happening inside the private family unit. That's a huge psychological claim.
It is. This inward moral space provided the foundation for the property owner, the bourgeois, to justify his transformation into the universal human being, the home, when he stepped into the public sphere.
Can you break that down, the bourgeois versus the home?
The bourgeois was the private individual,
Yeah.
focused on his wealth, his property.
Yeah.
But the home was the citizen, claiming rights and claiming to represent all of humanity.
I see.
By grounding his political claims in this cultivated moral space from the home, the property owner lent this crucial non-economic justification to his political demands for liberty and representation.
That dual identity is just central then. It explains why they felt they had the moral authority to challenge the absolute state.
And this concept, interestingly, tacitly adopts, but then completely upends a concept from Carl Schmitt.
The controversial legal theorist.
The very one. Yeah. Schmitt's Civil War topos. Schmitt argued that the state had to create a moral inner space that was exempt from its violence in order to end the religious wars of the 17th century.
Okay.
Habermas shows how the bourgeois effectively took that idea, that exempt moral inner space, and transformed it to valorize their own specific brand of humanism and to justify their own political revolution.
So the citizen isn't just a political actor, he's a morally cultivated individual. And this cultivation eventually hits its political climax in the revolutions.
Exactly.
Now, the British system, with its gradual reforms, the famous coffee houses, that's often seen as the model case.
It is.
But Habermas points to something else as the tacit model case for realizing the pure Kantian ideal. He points to the French Revolution.
Yes. But this needs a very careful qualification. Habermas isn't focusing on the historical outcome, which, as we all know, rapidly descended into the terror.
Right, I have to challenge this because this is where history gets messy. How can the French Revolution, which, devoured its own children, be the ideal realization of rational law-giving?
That's the essential question. And Habermas's focus is on the radical, unprecedented philosophical act of founding.
The act of founding.
Yes, the National Assembly's debates that led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, for him, that finalized the process. As the sources note, the philosophers had become lawgivers.
So it's about the principle, not the bloody outcome.
It's about the direct and successful transfer of Kant's abstract, universal moral laws into binding constitutional law, constructed out of subjective rights. For Habermas, that moment, just before the terror, was this historically unprecedented act of founding a democratic constitutional order based purely on reason and moral principles, not on tradition, not on divine right. It was the absolute apex of the rational ideal.
So a perfect ideal on paper, even if the practice immediately proved, well, impossible to sustain, we have this beautifully constructed moral edifice, but now we have to confront the hidden beams holding it up. Let's talk about those economic fictions.
Yes, Part 1 described an ideal that sought to dissolve domination and ground law in reason. Here is where the deep dive gets really critical.
Okay.
That entire ideal was utterly dependent on what our sources call economic fictions. These were presuppositions that were philosophical necessities, not empirical realities.
And the foundational presupposition was this belief that liberal capitalism itself was governed by immutable natural laws of society.
Exactly. Laws that would self-regulate the political economy. The BPS, where citizens debate the common good, could only function if the economic sphere, the market, was already presumed to be basically just and harmonious.
And the most important of these fictions
Was Say's law of markets. This was a law popularized by the physiocrats and Adam Smith, and it guaranteed that market-based exchange would be harmonious and crisis-free.
Okay, for listeners who might not be economists, Say's law, in a nutshell, is supply creates its own demand.
That's the simple version, yes.
So in its idealized form, it meant that production automatically generates the income needed to buy that production, which ensures full employment and prevents any big crises or gluts.
Exactly. It was stylized as an iron law, the economic equivalent of, say, perpetual motion or Newton's law of gravity. It guaranteed that the economic planets wouldn't collide.
And without that guarantee of stability and justice,
The property owner, the bourgeois, could not plausibly claim he was acting as the universal citizen, the home. The whole justification for private property and self-interest relied entirely on this fiction, that self-interest ultimately served the general interest automatically.
this connects directly back to that famous philosophical paradox of the age. Mandeville's?
Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, yes, which famously asserted that private vices lead to public benefits.
The greedy baker who only seeks profit ends up feeding the whole city.
Right, and that paradox that selfish acts produce beneficial social outcomes, that was the direct inspiration for Adam Smith's subsequent idea of the invisible hand.
And Kant, as we discussed, he faced this challenge head on. If humans are inherently selfish, if they're secretly inclined to exempt themselves from universal laws, how do you build a rational constitution that forces them to behave as if they were morally good?
Kant's constitutional structure was the direct solution to Mandeville's problem. And the fiction of a self-regulating, crisis-free economy was the necessary mechanism to transform that selfish private intention into good public conduct.
In short, the entire conflation of the bourgeois, the self-interested economic actor, and the home, the morally grounded citizen, was only what rendered plausible.
Rendered plausible, yes, by this deeply held, if fictitious, belief in a justice immanent in free commerce. The public sphere didn't have to worry about economic inequality because the economy was, by its nature, just.
But the internal contradictions were there from the beginning, right? Even with the original proponents. Adam Smith, the architect of the invisible hand, simultaneously wrote things that completely undermine this ideal.
He did. Our sources highlight a crucial tension here. Smith himself, in The Wealth of Nations, attributed natural selfishness and rapacity specifically to the rich.
Wow.
And even more remarkably, he declared that he had never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good.
That's a stunning statement from the supposed champion of free markets. It just exposes the fiction's purely instrumental role.
It does. The bourgeois was acting entirely in self-interest. But the idea of economic justice allowed him to stand up in the public sphere and claim he was acting for the common good.
Okay, so this lets us pivot to a necessary point about Habermas's own method. He used a dialectical, counterfactual ideology critique.
Yes, which he derived from the earlier Frankfurt School thinkers like Marcuse and Horkheimer.
Hold on, counterfactual critique? That sounds highly technical. Does that just mean Habermas was saying the ideal, rational public sphere never actually existed in its pure form?
Exactly.
But he's treating it as if it did, just so he can analyze the political and philosophical implications of its later failure.
That is precisely it. That's the most accessible way to put it. He was searching for the utopian surplus, the genuine rational potential that was embedded within those revolutionary ideals, even if the historical reality was messy, self-interested, or contradictory.
And the sources say he intentionally disregarded historical details that didn't fit this ideal typical stylization.
Correct. We see this really clearly in the British model case. STPS largely neglects key political journalism of the era, like Daniel Defoe's review.
Or what about the pivotal, messy struggles of someone like John Wilkes for press freedom?
He minimizes those too, yes. Habermas minimized those real-world political struggles because they didn't sufficiently advance the philosophical goal of rationalizing politics in the name of morality.
They were too partisan, too unenlightened.
In his view, yes. They were too focused on partisan squabbles or immediate political outcomes. He wanted the pure form of rational communication, not the rough and tumble of actual 18th century political lobbying.
So the ideal BPS was a beautiful philosophical creation, an intellectual blueprint, but not a perfect historical description. And historical reality eventually caught up to the fiction. So what brought the whole structure crashing down?
The failure of the fictions themselves, the core structural conflict of society, which liberalism had denied, the conflict between capital and labor, the inherent instability of unfettered markets. It all became unconcealed after a long period of prosperity.
And we have to acknowledge that period of unique prosperity, don't we? The success of the BPS in the first half of the 19th century wasn't because of some natural law.
Not at all. It was a function of unique historical circumstances, specifically a vast secular boom that ran roughly from 1775 to 1875, fueled by industrialization and global expansion.
So that boom created enough wealth to sort of paper over the cracks.
It smoothed over the structural contradictions, yes. But the collapse of the liberal era arrived decisively with the failure of Say's law. It came to grief, as the sources say, in the first global economic crisis, the Long Depression, beginning in 1873.
So once the economy proved it was not self-regulating, that it was inherently prone to these massive cycles of boom and bust,
the moral justification for the property owner just collapsed. The fiction of inherent justice was destroyed by mass unemployment and systemic crisis. The property owner could no longer credibly claim to be acting for the universal common good.
And once that happens,
The long history of decline, or Volksgeschichte, as it's called, began. Public debate, which had been idealized as this rational deliberation, was visibly replaced by an unconcealed compromise between competing interests, all brokered behind closed doors.
and philosophically.
Philosophically, this led straight to the crisis of meaning and moral relativism, which is exemplified most powerfully by Nietzsche's nihilism, the belief that truth, not authority, makes law. Well, that died when the mechanism meant to deliver that truth, the market, was exposed as arbitrary and prone to collapse.
So by the late 19th century, the ideal is just shattered. Rationality is replaced by political bargaining, economic fictions are replaced by economic crisis, and this decline continues through the 20th century. But then, in the 1970s, we see this astonishing reversal, a dedicated attempt to resurrect these dead economic fictions.
This is the era of the neoliberal counter-reformation. The economic instability of the 1970s, inflationary pressures, the end of Bretton Woods, the oil crises, it created the perfect environment for a radical philosophical movement to gain traction.
This was famously dubbed voodoo economics by George H.W. Bush, but it was championed by figures like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman.
Exactly. They took what were considered fringe, free market heresies and, through the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions, successfully institutionalized them as the new global orthodoxy.
And Friedman was the key figure in selling it to the public, wasn't it?
He was the great popularizer, yes. He made this anti-Keynesian doctrine palatable.
And what was the political consequence of that shift?
A seismic shift in governance. This counter-reformation granted just unprecedented political legitimacy to the social powers of capitalists, what we now call the 1%. This power was institutionalized as the absolute, almost divine right to appropriate surplus value and use it privately and autonomously.
So governance itself was redefined.
Fundamentally, it prioritized shareholder interest above almost all else, which is a complete contradiction of the BPS ideal that prioritized the general interest.
And Habermas connects this neoliberal turn directly to the modern crisis of democratic legitimacy. He argues that democracies only lose their footing if they fail to satisfy the material preconditions for citizen autonomy.
That link is absolutely crucial.
If you don't have economic independence, you can't be a free citizen.
Precisely. And we can link this crisis back to international agreements, specifically the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23 CLI, the fundamental right to remuneration ensuring an existence worthy of human dignity. The systematic erosion of this material safety net is a direct consequence of that neoliberal prioritization of shareholder value.
Our sources give a staggering illustration of this systematic failure, the minimum wage gap. We have to sit with this number for a moment. If the federal minimum wage had kept pace with both inflation and productivity gains, as it consistently did until 1968.
Right at the peak of that post-war BPS ideal.
Right, what would that number be today?
The sources calculate it would be around $24 per hour today.
$24 an hour.
Think about the psychological, social, and political ramifications of that gap. The federal minimum is currently stuck at $7.25. It's been stagnant for over a decade.
So the difference between $7.25 and $24, that's not just a number. It illustrates the systematic failure of the modern state to satisfy the basic material interests and autonomy of huge segments of society.
It does. And that numerical reality alone provides the context for the widespread political disappointment and rage we see all across Western democracies. This systematic socioeconomic injustice leads directly to a political danger that some analysts saw coming decades ago.
Right, this wasn't unforeseen.
Not at all. The prediction made by political philosophers like Richard Rorty and military strategists like Edward Litwack years before the major populist surges was dire. They predicted that accelerating inequality, globalization, and outsourcing would create such bitter disappointment among blue-collar workers,
The working poor.
that they would start looking around for a strong man to vote for.
So when the economic system fails to deliver on the promises of the democratic state, people start seeking a charismatic authority figure outside the normal political structures.
And Habermas's 2021 analysis confirms this bottom-up pressure. He shows how democracies lose their legitimacy when they fail to provide the fundamental legal and material conditions for a self-determining citizenry.
Which brings us to the new globalized structure that is just pouring gasoline on this fire, the digital transformation.
And Habermas sees this as an existential threat. It represents the ultimate global dimension of commodification, and it's all facilitated by omnipresent digital surveillance.
This is where that collapse of the market versus the public sphere distinction becomes total. The U.S. Supreme Court, back in 2017, they may have called social media the modern public square.
But that title is dangerously misleading. It's functionally false.
So they're not public squares. They're what we said before.
They're privately owned shopping malls. The rules governing political discourse are not constitutional or deliberative. They are commercial. They are designed for one purpose and one purpose only: the perpetual captivity of user attention to continuously harvest data for profit.
And that isn't just an accident. It's the core business model: surveillance capitalism. And this has profound structural consequences for political life through algorithmic manipulation.
The algorithms are sophisticated, and they're designed to keep users engaged. And what keeps us engaged?
Strong emotion, anger, fear, outrage.
Exactly. The algorithms imprison users in these echo chambers of their own prejudices, reinforcing what they already believe and leading to what Habermas called autistic narcissism.
Autistic narcissism.
It actively deforms the perception of the public sphere as such. We stop seeing it as a space for shared problem solving and start seeing it as just a curated projection of our own identity and pre-existing beliefs.
And the most insidious part is how this deformation is explicitly monetized, converting political discourse directly into private gain. And we have a really powerful specific example from the sources about how this monetization model works during elections, using the Philippines as a case study.
Okay, so consider the election involving Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Political falsehoods, like the brazen lie that the Philippines' national debt had doubled to $50 billion under Corazon Aquino, are spread by social media influencers.
And these influencers are often former sales agents, right? They're skilled in what the sources call the private gain mentality of salesmanship.
Exactly, and they don't necessarily get a direct payment from the campaign.
So how does the lie actually turn into profit for the influencer and for the platform?
The platform does the work. When the influencer is live streaming an election rally, the attention of their followers is automatically auctioned off by the social media platform to consumer product brands for advertising.
Wait, so the platform converts the political lie, the sensational, outrageous falsehood that generates the most attention,
Into advertising revenue derived from selling consumer goods. The political lie is literally financially subsidized by the sale of toothpaste and electronics.
That is a perfect and terrifying illustration of how the structural failure of the digital public sphere works. The profit motive is literally dependent on reinforcing prejudice and broadcasting lies.
It replaces the original public interest orientation of citizenship with the calculating, self-interested, private gain mentality of salesmanship.
And the crisis becomes systemic.
It does. It happens when citizens conduct their political discourse on social media as if they were in a digital shopping mall, leading to an environment where, as one campaign manager cynically noted, all candidates, all political parties engage in disinformation.
And the academic analysis confirms this. It shows that algorithms prioritize negative emotions like fear and anger because they are simply more viral in a mass audience.
Which systematically gives an advantage to populist or authoritarian messages.
And this structural crisis puts the foundational institution of the original BPS, the free press, under immense existential pressure. Our sources identify this as a clear indicator of a global retreat from democracy toward authoritarianism.
We see this dramatically in the Philippines with the Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa. She faces repeated arrests, legal persecution for cyber libel, all while actively fighting the state-sponsored digital disinformation that helped bring in the Marcos regime. Her struggle is a frontline defense of journalism itself.
And we're seeing chilling precedents being set in mature democratic countries as well.
We are. The sources specifically contrast Ressa's fight with the attempt by the U.S. government to extradite Julian Assange.
Right.
Reporters Without Borders warn that the U.S. charges against Assange, which essentially treat the seeking and publishing of classified information, a core journalistic activity, as a crime under the Espionage Act, set a dangerous implication for the future of journalism and press freedom around the world.
The irony is just inescapable. The functionality of the public sphere is now defined by its ability to influence politics, to serve the general interest against the relentless structural dominance of the shareholder interest.
The core principle of Friedmanite doctrine.
And when the free press is treated as criminal by one of the world's leading democracies and political discourse is monetized by Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
the Habermasian ideal is, well, it's truly in crisis.
Which brings us all the way back to that original demand made by the bourgeois revolutionary.
And
That law must be grounded in justice, not just in political will. That demand, articulated back in the 18th century, feels more urgent than ever when justice is being systematically eroded by economic forces we are not even allowed to publicly examine. So we began this deep dive with Habermas's ideal, a rational public sphere, the BPS, founded on this beautiful moral fiction that the citizen, the home, could transcend the self-interest of the bourgeois. We've traced the long Verfolgsgeschichte, that history of decline, showing how those fictions collapsed in the crisis of 1873, and then how they were cynically resurrected by the neoliberal counter-reformation that prioritized shareholder value above all else.
And we end today where?
We end today with a hyper-commercialized digital public sphere that actively exploits fundamental human vices, fear, anger, narcissistic tendencies, for continuous monetized profit through surveillance capitalism. This environment makes the political ideal of a deliberative, rational public sphere virtually impossible to achieve.
The central conflict, then, it's not really philosophical anymore, is it? It's structural and economic. Can political power be organized to serve the general interest when the most powerful social institutions of our age, Wall Street's financial structures and Silicon Valley's platforms, are legally and structurally obligated to serve the shareholder interest?
And this forces us to revive Kant's original challenge. Just as he demanded in the 18th century that the institutions of church and state, the old centers of power, be subjected to free and open examination to test their legitimacy.
We have to do the same today.
Today, we must subject the new institutions of social power, Silicon Valley and Wall Street, to that same rigorous public critique. Since the crises of the 19th century proved there are no natural laws to organize society harmoniously, reason has to be the steering mechanism, and critique must be the tool.
And here is the provocative thought we want to leave you with. The bourgeois revolutionaries, the ones who launched the BPS, they were energized by what the sources call a zeal and greatness of soul for their cause, the realization of the concept of universal right. Franklin D. Roosevelt famously argued that political equality is meaningless in the face of economic inequality. So when the citizens' material and political rights have been so systematically undermined by the neoliberal project, resulting in that minimum wage gap that symbolizes systematic injustice, and when political engagement is channeled through the algorithmic preferences of a digital shopping mall, can the citizen reemerge from the consumer to reclaim that zeal? Or will political action remain forever sublimated in the aesthetic, fleeting choices of the digital age?